They told her Americans were devils who would rape and murder without mercy. In 3 months, she would discover a truth so devastating it would shatter everything she had been taught to believe. But on that June morning in 1901, huddled in a cave on Saipan, 22-year-old Haruko Matsuda was still a true believer, and she was waiting to die with honor. The world had ended 3 days ago, not with the honorable silence of the ancestors, but with the shriek of American steel tearing through the island's volcanic rock. For weeks, the jungle had ceased to be a place of shadow and vine. It had become a roaring furnace. The air itself was shredded thick with the metallic stench of cordite diesel fumes and the sweet, terrible copper smell of blood that no amount of ocean wind could wash away. Haruko pressed her back against the damp cave wall, clutching her medical kit. It had been empty for 2 days. No more bandages, no more sulfa powder. No more morphine for the men whose screams had finally faded into the merciful silence of death. Around her in the darkness, the last of the wounded lay in positions that suggested sleep, but sleep required hope, and hope had died with the final bonsai charge. The propaganda had promised them devils. The teachers in Nagasaki, the officers on the transport ships, the radio broadcast that crackled through the island's command posts. They had all spoken with absolute certainty. The Americans were white-skinned barbarians from a decadent, lazy land. They fought without honor. They raped their conquered women. They mutilated the dead. They took pleasure in cruelty. Death, the propaganda insisted, was infinitely preferable to the dishonor of surrender. Haruko had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? She was 22 years old, the daughter of a school teacher in Hiroshima. She had trained as a nurse at the Christian mission school in Nagasaki, where stern-faced nuns taught her to clean wounds and recite prayers in an equal measure. When the war came, when the emperor himself called for nurses to serve the divine mission, she had volunteered without hesitation. Her younger brother Takeshi was training to be a kamikaze pilot. How could she do less? She carried his photograph in her kit, a small black and white image of a boy who looked too young to shave, standing stiffly in his flight cadet uniform, trying to look brave. She had not heard from him in 4 months. She would never hear from him again. But that loss would be small compared to the loss of everything she believed in. And that loss would begin in approximately 90 seconds when the Americans finally cleared this cave. Outside, the voices were growing closer. They were shouting in English, a language she had learned just enough of to understand commands. Get out, move, clear the cave. The accent was strange, harsh. Nothing like the careful pronunciation of her mission school teachers. These were the voices of men who had been killing for days without rest. Men whose patience had been burned away by the furnace of battle. Beside Haruko, a young nurse named Yumi clutched a grenade with trembling hands. She was 19 years old. Her fingers kept moving toward the pin, then pulling back, then moving forward again. She was crying silently, her whole body shaking with the effort of trying to be brave enough to die. Further back in the cave, Keiko Yamamoto sat perfectly still. At 45, she was the oldest among them, a former teacher who had lost both of her sons in combat. One had died at Guadalcanal. The other had been killed during the defense of this very island, blown apart by naval artillery 3 weeks ago. Keiko's face was a mask of rigid composure. She had taught generations of children that the emperor was divine, that Japan's mission was sacred, that the Americans were demons who must be resisted unto death. She could not allow herself to doubt now. Doubt would mean her sons had died for a lie. The sound of boots on rock, the rattle of equipment. Then a shape appeared at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the blinding tropical sunlight. A giant. That was Haruko's first coherent thought. The soldier seemed impossibly tall, built of muscle and sweat and war paint. His face was smeared with green and black camouflage that made him look like something from a nightmare, like an oni from the old stories her grandmother used to tell. He was not supposed to look frightened, but he did. His eyes were wide and he was screaming. Not in rage, not in bloodlust. He was screaming with the raw-edged panic of a man who had seen too many of his friends die, who knew that desperate soldiers in caves sometimes had grenades, sometimes had one last bullet, sometimes chose to take their enemies with them into death. "Get out," he shouted. "We're clearing it. Get the hell out." Yumi's hand tightened on the grenade. Haruko could see her knuckles going white, could see the exact moment when the girl made her decision. This was it. This was the glorious death they had been promised. She would pull the pin. They would all die together. The emperor would honor their sacrifice. The American soldier saw the grenade. His rifle was already raised. He could have fired. 20 years later, Haruko would still dream about this moment, still wonder why he did not fire. But instead of pulling the trigger, he lunged forward with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. He knocked the grenade from Yumi's hand with a blow that sent it skittering across the cave floor. Then he slapped Yumi across the face. Not with cruelty. That was the detail that Haruko's mind kept returning to, kept examining like a strange artifact that did not fit any known category. The slap was sharp, stunning, but it was not cruel. It was the kind of slap you would give someone who was hysterical, someone who was about to do something catastrophically stupid. It was the slap of a man trying to wake someone from a nightmare. He grabbed Yumi by the arm and dragged her bodily toward the cave entrance. More soldiers poured in behind him, their movements practiced and impersonal and terrifyingly efficient. They were not conquerors savoring victory. They were not demons reveling in cruelty. They were exterminators, clearing a nest professionals doing an ugly job they wanted to finish as quickly as possible. Haruko found herself being pulled to her feet by hands that were rough but not violent. She stumbled toward the light, her legs numb from 3 days of sitting. The sunlight hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could see nothing but white glare. Then her vision cleared and she saw what had become of Saipan. The island was gone. That was her first thought. The green jungle she remembered from her arrival 6 months ago had been replaced by a lunar landscape of shell craters and shattered trees. The air was thick with smoke and coral dust. Everywhere she looked, there were American machines, tanks, jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, bulldozers already pushing aside rubble to clear roads. The vehicles moved in a synchronized parade, an endless stream of olive-drab metal that seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. The Imperial Army had fought with courage. The Imperial Army had fought with spirit. The Imperial Army had fought with the strength of men who believed they were defending a divine emperor in a sacred homeland. The Americans had fought with factories. They had fought with an industrial capacity so vast it seemed to mock the very concept of sacrifice. Why die gloriously when you could simply build more tanks than the enemy could ever hope to destroy? The women were herded into a tight cluster, perhaps 20 of them in all. They stood in the brilliant sunlight, a small trembling group of soiled cotton and matted black hair, fully expecting the final bullet. The execution, the vengeance, the punishment that any rational conqueror would inflict. Instead, a soldier with a red cross on his helmet approached. He was younger than the giant who had cleared the cave, maybe 20 years old with a sunburned face and kind eyes. He knelt in front of Haruko and offered his canteen. Water, he said. Mizu. He knew the Japanese word. He had taken the time to learn it. This fact would not fully register in Haruko's mind until much later, but it would become one of the most important details of her entire life. This American soldier, this supposed devil, had learned to say water in Japanese because he anticipated meeting Japanese people who would be thirsty. Haruko stared at the metal canteen as if it were a serpent. This had to be a trick. The water would be poisoned. Or this was some elaborate torture offering hope before delivering despair. The medic seemed to understand her fear. He sighed, unscrewed the cap, and drank from the canteen himself, taking a long swallow. Then he offered it again. Timidly, Haruko drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted of chlorine and metal, but it was clean. It was the first clean water she had tasted in a week. The sensation of it on her cracked lips, on her swollen tongue, was so intensely pleasurable it almost hurt. An Oni behaving with basic humanity. That was the first crack in the foundation of everything Haruko Matsuda had been taught to believe. It was a hairline fracture barely visible, easy to dismiss. But it was there. And over the next 3 months, that crack would widen into a chasm that would swallow her entire understanding of the world. What she would learn about America in the next 90 days would make this small kindness seem like nothing. By the time she stood on the docks of Yokohama 9 months later, Haruko Matsuda would be a different person entirely. But first she had to survive the processing. They were marched to a collection point, a cleared area of ground, surrounded by concertina wire, and guarded by soldiers who looked more bored than alert. The march took them past an endless display of American power. Entire fields of supplies stacked in neat rows covered with canvas tarps, mountains of ammunition crates, fuel drums arranged in precise geometric patterns, And the machines, always the machines. They never stopped moving. Trucks arrived empty and departed full. Forklifts shifted pallets with mechanical efficiency. Somewhere in the distance, Haruko could hear the roar of bulldozers, the clang of metal on metal, the deep throb of generators. The processing was a blur of humiliation and confusion. They were ordered to strip. This was it, Haruko thought. This was where the rape would begin, where the propaganda would prove true. But the soldiers who examined them were brisk and professional. Their hands did not linger. Their eyes did not leer. They were checking for weapons, for wounds, for signs of disease. They were processing inventory. Then came the delousing powder, a white chemical snow that stung the eyes and coated everything. The soldiers dusted them as if they were vegetables being prepared for market. It stripped away the last shreds of dignity, but it was not deliberately cruel. It was simply necessary. Lice carried disease. Disease killed people. The Americans, it seemed, preferred to keep their prisoners alive. The medics who came next treated wounds with clean bandages and stinging antiseptic. Haruko watched as a young American corpsman gently cleaned a gash on Yumi's arm. He smiled at the girl, who flinched as if expecting a blow. The corpsman just patted her shoulder and moved to the next woman. His touch had been kind, not lustful, not cruel, simply kind. Haruko felt something cold and heavy settling in her chest. If the Americans were devils, they were very strange devils indeed. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Many of you watching grew up during or right after this war. Some of you served. Some of you might have even encountered Japanese or German prisoners of war in your own hometowns. If you or your family members have stories about treating former enemies with dignity or about witnessing America's values in action during wartime, please share them in the comments below. These stories matter. Your generation understands something about American character that we need to preserve. Now let me take you back to June 1944. Haruko Matsuda was born in Hiroshima in 1922, the daughter of a school teacher who loved poetry and the sound of rain on temple roofs. She grew up in a world of paper screens and careful rituals where every gesture had meaning and every word carried weight. Her father taught classical literature at the boys' school. Her mother arranged flowers and poured tea with the precision of a surgeon. It was a life of quiet beauty and rigid order. When Haruko turned 16, her father sent her to the Christian mission school in Nagasaki. It was one of the few places where girls could receive advanced education, where they could learn skills beyond flower arranging and tea ceremony. The nuns were strict foreign women with pale skin and strange accents, but they taught real medicine. They taught anatomy and pharmacology and surgical technique. And they taught English, which they insisted was essential for any modern nurse. Haruko had been a good student. She memorized vocabulary lists and practiced pronunciation until her tongue ached. She learned to say please and thank you and where does it hurt. She learned the names of bones and organs and diseases. She learned that the human body was the same everywhere, that Japanese blood and American blood looked identical under a microscope, that pain crossed all borders and required no translation. But she had also absorbed the other lessons, the ones that came from the radio and the newspapers and the speeches in the school assembly. Japan was encircled by enemies. The Western powers wanted to destroy the divine emperor and enslave the Japanese people. The Americans in particular were lazy and decadent, a mongrel nation with no culture and no honor. Their soldiers were cowards who relied on machines instead of spirit. When Japan's superior warrior ethos finally clashed with American softness, the outcome would be inevitable. She carried a small photograph in her medical kit. Her younger brother Takeshi, 17 years old, standing in his flight cadet uniform. He was trying to look serious, but his eyes held a glint of excitement. He had written to her from the training base, his letters full of proud declarations about serving the emperor, about the honor of being chosen for special duty. He never wrote the word kamikaze, but Haruko knew. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended it was glorious. She would never see him again. His plane would crash into the ocean during a training flight 3 weeks after Saipan fell. No enemy to fight, no glorious death, just a mechanical failure in the cold, indifferent Pacific. But the loss of Takeshi would pale compared to the loss of everything she believed in. And that loss would begin the moment she stepped onto an American ship. By June 1944, the Battle of Saipan was entering its final desperate phase. Of the 32,000 Japanese defenders who had sworn to die rather than surrender, fewer than 1,000 would survive. The propaganda machine had prepared Japanese civilians and soldiers for one outcome, only glorious death in service of the emperor. What the propaganda had not prepared them for was survival, and what came after. The collection point became a temporary camp. Tents were erected with startling speed. Latrines were dug. Fresh water was trucked in. The prisoners were given rice balls and canned meat and real vegetables. The portions were small, but they were regular. 3 times a day, like clockwork. The Americans seemed obsessed with schedules, with routine, with the systematic organization of even the smallest details. On the third day, they were loaded onto trucks, not cattle cars, not cramped cages, but open-topped military transports with bench seats and canvas covers to block the sun. The convoy drove to the coast, and Haruko saw what the bombardment had done to the port. Every building was shattered. Every dock was splintered. But already American engineers were rebuilding. Bulldozers pushed debris into piles. Welding torches sparked as crews repaired twisted metal. The Americans did not conquer and move on. They conquered and built. They turned destruction into infrastructure with the same mechanical efficiency they applied to everything else. The harbor was not a harbor. It was a forest of steel masts. Dozens of ships, gray and enormous, sat in the water like sleeping whales. Cranes lifted cargo from their holds in an endless, rhythmic cycle. Each ship looked large enough to hold Haruko's entire village, and there were so many of them. How could Japan hope to fight a nation that could build ships faster than they could be sunk? They were taken to a transport ship, a vast wall of steel that loomed over the dock. The sailors on deck were young men in white hats chewing gum and smoking cigarettes. They watched the prisoners come aboard with a kind of bored curiosity, the way you might watch sparrows landing on a fence. There was no hatred in their eyes. No triumph, no particular interest at all. To these sailors, the war was a job. The Japanese prisoners were just another cargo manifest to be checked off and stowed below. This indifference was more crushing than cruelty would have been. To the divine soldiers of the emperor, these Americans were the ultimate enemy, the final obstacle to Japan's sacred destiny. To the Americans, the Japanese were simply a problem to be processed. One among many, nothing special, nothing worth getting emotional about. They were shown to a hole deep in the ship's belly. Haruko expected a cage, a dark pit, maybe chains. What she found was a room filled with tiered metal bunks, each one equipped with a thin mattress and a clean gray wool blanket. The air was warm and humid, but it moved. Ventilation fans hummed somewhere in the darkness. And beneath everything constant and powerful was the deep rhythmic pulse of the engines. The ship was alive, a creature of steel and steam waiting to carry them across an ocean to an unknown fate. That night the first meal came. That night everything changed. The metal trays were heavy. That was the first thing Haruko noticed when the sailor handed one through the doorway. Heavy with food, thick stew with chunks of actual beef floating in rich brown gravy. A slice of white bread so soft and pale it seemed to be made of clouds. A square of yellow butter wrapped in paper. And coffee. Real coffee, steaming in a tin cup, its aroma so rich and complex it made Haruko's empty stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. The women stared at their trays in silence. Then someone began to weep. Then another. Then they were all eating with the frantic, desperate movements of people who had forgotten what abundance felt like. They hoarded the bread, stuffing it into pockets for later. They licked the trays clean. They drank the coffee so fast it burned their mouths, and they did not care. Haruko forced herself to eat slowly. She forced herself to chew each bite to make it last. The beef was tender and salty and perfect. The bread dissolved on her tongue like sweetness itself. The butter was a luxury she had not tasted since before the war began. And with each bite, each swallow, each moment of this impossible feast, she felt the foundations of her world beginning to crack. This was not prisoner rations. This was abundance. This was what the Americans fed to their enemies. What did they feed to their own people? What kind of nation had so much food it could afford to waste it on captured nurses from a defeated island? Across the dim hold, Keiko Yamamoto sat perfectly still, staring at her empty tray. Tears streamed down her weathered face, but she made no sound. She had taught her students that Americans were lazy, that their factories were shams built on Hollywood lies, that their food was poisoned with decadence and weakness. Now she held a metal tray that had contained more protein than a Japanese family ate in a week. Her ideology did not crack. It shattered, like glass, like bone, like faith, and she did not speak again for 3 days. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the very concept of reality bent and twisted until Haruko no longer knew what was true and what was propaganda. The fear of capture, that animal terror that had gripped her throat in the cave on Saipan, slowly dissolved into something far more disturbing, a profound, paralyzing bewilderment. The Americans sailed with their lights on. This fact, more than any other, would haunt Haruko for the rest of her life. At night, when the prisoners were sometimes allowed on deck for air, she would stand in the salt spray and watch the other ships in the convoy. They glowed. Each vessel blazed with electric light, glowing islands moving across the dark water with an arrogance that seemed to mock the very existence of submarines, of torpedoes, of death itself. In Japan, night meant absolute darkness. The blackout was enforced with fanatical severity. To show a light after sunset was to invite a visit from the Kempei Tai, the military police who carried bamboo swords and had the authority to beat citizens for even minor infractions. Children learned to navigate their homes in perfect darkness. Families ate cold dinners because cooking fires might be visible through cracks in the walls. The night sky over Tokyo was black and silent, a void punctuated only by searchlights stabbing upward, hunting for American bombers. But here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the American convoy sailed like a carnival. Running lights marked every ship. Portholes glowed warm yellow. On the larger vessels, Haruko could see the silhouettes of sailors moving across illuminated decks, smoking cigarettes, playing cards under electric lamps, as if they were sitting in a comfortable cafe somewhere far from danger. Yumi stood beside her one night, gripping the rail with white-knuckled hands. She was 19 years old and she had never been on a ship before Saipan. The motion of the waves made her constantly nauseous, but she came up on deck anyway because the alternative was lying in the hot darkness below, alone with her thoughts. "They do not fear," Yumi whispered. Her voice was filled with a terrible awe. "They do not fear anything." It was true. The Americans moved through the world as if they owned it, as if the ocean was their private lake and the night was just another room to be illuminated at will. They had so much of everything, so much fuel and food and electricity and confidence, that they could afford to be wasteful. They could afford to be visible. They could afford to paint a target on themselves because they knew with absolute certainty that they would sink any submarine before it got close enough to matter. The ship ran on a schedule of terrifying precision. Reveille at 0600, breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800, lights out at 2200. The sailors moved through their routines with mechanical efficiency as if the ship were a living organism, and they were its component parts, each performing its function without question or deviation. The kitchens produced endless food. The showers ran with hot, fresh water. The engines never stopped, never faltered, never showed any sign of strain. This ship was just one of dozens in the convoy, and the convoy was just one of hundreds crossing the Pacific at any given moment. The scale of it was incomprehensible. How many factories did it take to build these ships? How many workers? How many tons of steel? How many gallons of fuel? Japan had thrown everything into this war. Every resource, every life, every ounce of national will. And the Americans were fighting them with what appeared to be a small fraction of their industrial capacity, almost as an afterthought, while simultaneously fighting Germany and Italy on the other side of the world. Haruko's education in propaganda had been thorough and absolute. America was a nation of selfish individuals, torn apart by racial chaos and economic inequality. Their soldiers were undisciplined. Their factories were built on slave labor and would collapse under pressure. Their people were soft, addicted to luxury, incapable of the kind of sacrifice that defined the Japanese spirit. Yet every day on that ship, the lie was stripped away layer by layer. The sailors were not undisciplined. They followed orders with instant obedience. The ship did not collapse. It ran with the smooth power of a machine that had been built by people who understood engineering at a level Japan could not match. And the food, the endless, impossible food, proved that American abundance was not a Hollywood fantasy. It was real. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. The guards were young Marines, most of them barely 20 years old. They treated the prisoners with a distant courtesy that was neither kind nor cruel. It was simply correct. They were guards. The women were prisoners. There was a procedure for this interaction, and the procedure would be followed because that was how things were done. They answered questions when they could using hand gestures and broken Japanese words learned from pocket phrase books. They shared their magazines, sometimes glossy publications filled with colorful photographs of smiling women in elegant dresses, shiny automobiles parked in front of neat suburban houses, advertisements for products Haruko had never heard of: Coca-Cola, Frigidaire, General Electric. The magazine showed a world of casual prosperity that seemed as distant and impossible as the surface of the moon. One of the guards was different. Corporal Sam Nolan, sandy-haired and tired-eyed from a place called Wyoming. He was not one of the giants who had cleared the cave. He was of average height, with a lean, rangy build and a face that looked young until you saw his eyes. His eyes were older than they should have been, marked by the kind of exhaustion that sleep could not fix. Sam carried a small notebook, and he was teaching himself Japanese. He would sit near the hold entrance during his breaks, reading from the notebook and muttering words to himself. His pronunciation was terrible. He made Haruko wince every time he tried to say good morning or thank you, but he was trying. That effort, however clumsy, was worth noting. Sometimes he would show the women pictures from his magazines. "This is Wyoming," he would say, pointing to an endless landscape of grassland under enormous skies. "Many cows. Oi ushi." The women would nod politely, not understanding why anyone would want to live in such empty space. Japan was crowded and green and vertical. This Wyoming looked like the surface of another planet. Sam carried something else too, a photograph in his wallet, though he had not shown it to anyone yet. But he would. In a few days on a train crossing the American heartland, he would pull out that photograph and show it to Haruko. And when she saw it, when she looked at the image of a smiling young woman holding a fat, laughing baby, she would understand that the propaganda had committed a crime beyond lying about American military strength. It had lied about American humanity, and that lie had cost a generation everything. The days blurred together in a rhythm of routine and bewilderment. Wake, eat, sit, eat, sleep. The food never diminished in quality or quantity. The ship never showed any sign of strain. The sailors went about their duties with the kind of bored professionalism that suggested this voyage was nothing special, just another run across the Pacific, no different from a dozen others they had made. As the weeks passed, the women's conversations began to change. The initial terror faded. The shame remained, but it was joined by something new. Curiosity. What was this America? Where were they being taken? What would happen when they arrived? "They will put us in factories," one woman insisted. She had been a school teacher in Osaka before the war. "They will make us build bombs to drop on our homes. They don't need us to build bombs," Yumi said quietly. She gestured to the massive ship around them, to the endless evidence of industrial capacity. "They are the factory." It was true. Everything about the Americans spoke of mass production, of standardization of systems designed to function with or without individual genius. The rifles all looked identical. The uniforms were all cut from the same pattern. The food came in cans with printed labels produced in quantities that suggested factories the size of cities. Japan had artisans, America had assembly lines, and the assembly lines, it seemed, were winning. On the 21st day, the coastline appeared. At first, it was just a line on the horizon, a suggestion of land that might have been clouds or wishful thinking. But as the ship drew closer, the line resolved into hills, then mountains, then something that made Haruko's breath catch in her throat. A bridge, painted a deep, impossible red, soaring over the water on cables that seemed too delicate to support such weight. Its towers rose higher than any building Haruko had ever seen, disappearing into the morning fog like the pillars of heaven itself. This was not a bridge built by human hands. This was a bridge built by titans. The Golden Gate. That was what the sailors called it. They said it with the casual pride of men describing a particularly nice fence they had built in their backyard. No big deal, just the longest suspension bridge in the world. Just a structure that would have taken Japan a decade to build if Japan could have built it at all. Beyond the bridge, San Francisco rose from the hills like a vision from another world. A city of white buildings climbing up steep slopes, their windows catching the morning sun and throwing it back in sheets of golden light. The city was untouched, whole, perfect. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out blocks, no rubble. The war which had consumed Japan's cities in fire had not even brushed against this place. Haruko pressed her hands against the cold steel rail and looked at the civilization that had defeated her country. It was not a land of devils. It was a land of giants who built bridges to touch the sky in cities that glowed with confidence. It was a land so rich and so powerful that the war in the Pacific was just one of its many concerns, not even the most important one. The ship slid into San Francisco Bay through water that sparkled blue and clean. Haruko could see other ships, dozens of them, moving in a carefully choreographed dance. Freighters and tankers and warships and ferries all navigating the bay with the smooth precision of a machine that had been running for so long that perfection had become routine. The pier was a symphony of industrial noise. Gulls wheeled and screamed overhead, their cries lost in the roar of truck engines, the rumble of forklifts, and the rhythmic clang of gantry cranes unloading cargo from an endless succession of ships. The scale of the operation was staggering. This was just one port, just one city, and it processed more goods in a single day than Haruko had seen in her entire life. The prisoners were marched down the gangway in a tight column, heads down movements, stiff with a mixture of terror and shame. The dockworkers barely looked at them. A few sailors paused in their work to watch the column pass, but their expressions showed only mild curiosity. No hatred, no triumph, just the detached interest of men who had seen this particular cargo many times before. The lack of overt malice was its own kind of cruelty. It confirmed their irrelevance. They were not feared enemies. They were not hated adversaries. They were inventory. A shipment of prisoners to be moved from point A to point B, logged in the proper ledger and stored in the appropriate facility until the war ended and someone decided what to do with them. They were moved from the pier to a rail yard, a sprawling expanse of tracks that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The ground was covered in gravel and cinders sharp under the thin soles of Haruko's Zori sandals. The morning sun was already hot, and the smell of creosote and diesel fuel hung thick in the air. It was here, walking across that rail yard, that Haruko's right sandal finally gave up. The straw had been worn thin in the jungle, stressed by weeks of walking on rough ground. Now, on the sharp, oil-stained gravel of an American rail yard, the woven thongs simply snapped. The sole flopped uselessly. Haruko stumbled, catching herself before she fell, and was forced to limp forward with one foot bare. The gravel was hot and sharp. Each step sent small, bright points of pain through her foot. She could feel the skin breaking, could feel warm blood starting to seep between her toes. But she kept moving because to stop was to invite attention, and attention from the guards could mean anything. A voice barked from behind her. "Keep it moving, Tojo." The guard's tone was not particularly cruel. It was the voice of a man who had a schedule to keep and did not want complications. Haruko bit her lip to keep from crying out and hurried forward as best she could, her bare foot leaving small spots of blood on the pale gravel. She left the broken sandal behind, lying in the dust like a piece of discarded trash. They were being loaded onto a train. But this was not the kind of train Haruko had expected. These were not the wooden, unheated freight trains she had seen in propaganda films about prisoner transport. These cars were long and sleek, painted a deep, rich green with gold lettering on their sides. Pullman. The word meant nothing to Haruko, but the vehicles themselves spoke of luxury, of a level of comfort that seemed obscene for prisoner transport. An MP stood at the door of the nearest car, checking names against a clipboard. As Haruko reached the steps, she paused, trying to climb with her bare, bleeding foot without making a scene. The guard behind her raised his voice again. "Come on, let's go. We don't got all day." But the MP at the door, a young corporal with sandy hair, held up a hand. "Hold on, Sarge." He looked at Haruko. Really looked at her, not through her. His eyes dropped to her bare foot, then back to her face. He did not smirk. His expression was one of mild exasperation mixed with something that might have been sympathy. "Jesus," he muttered. He looked down the platform. "Wait here." He spoke the words slowly, gesturing for her to stay, using the kind of exaggerated pantomime you might use with a small child. Then he jogged away, disappearing into a small station building beside the tracks. The guard behind Haruko grumbled something about schedules and regulations, but the corporal's authority held. Haruko stood trembling, suddenly the object of unwanted attention. Yumi, just inside the train, watched with wide, frightened eyes. The corporal returned a minute later. He was holding a pair of simple canvas shoes and white cotton socks. They were worn but clean, clearly requisitioned from some supply locker. He approached Haruko, and then in full view of the entire platform, in full view of guards and prisoners and passing railroad workers, he knelt. An American soldier, a victor, a member of the conquering army, kneeling before a Japanese prisoner on the docks of San Francisco. He did not look at her face. His own face was flushed, as if he was embarrassed by the situation, uncomfortable with the attention. He pushed the socks and shoes toward her on the platform. "Put these on," he said. His voice was low and gruff. "We got a long way to go." Haruko stared at the offering. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. These were not simple straw sandals that could be woven by hand in an hour. These were manufactured goods. Complex. Stitched. Perfect. They represented industrial capacity and supply chains, and an economy that could produce such items in quantities large enough that a single pair could be given away to a prisoner without anyone caring about the loss. She tried to pull on the socks, but her hands would not cooperate. The corporal saw her struggle. "Here," he said. He grabbed her ankle, not cruelly, but with the firm, impersonal strength of a medic handling a patient, and lifted her foot. He brushed the gravel from the cuts on her sole, his fingers gentle. Then he pulled the sock onto her foot, guiding it up over her heel with practiced efficiency. He did the same for the other foot, even though that one was not injured. He tied both laces with quick, precise movements. Then he stood up, his face still flushed with embarrassment, and turned back to his clipboard. "All right, get on," he said. The brief moment of humanity was already buried under procedure, filed away under the category of minor problem solved. Haruko whispered arigato so quietly that he probably did not hear it. She stepped onto the train, feeling the soft, clean cotton against her skin. The sensation was more profound than the shock of the delousing powder, more overwhelming than the feast on the ship, because the cotton was not just comfort, it was evidence. Evidence that something fundamental about her understanding of the world had been wrong. How many had died on Saipan believing they faced devils? How many had thrown themselves from cliffs to avoid a torture that would never come? How many had killed their own children rather than let them fall into American hands? And all of it, all of that death and terror and grief had been based on a lie. The interior of the train car was a palace. The seats were not wooden benches, but plush, upholstered cushions that sank under Haruko's weight when she sat down. The walls were paneled in polished dark wood. The metal fixtures gleamed as if they had been polished that morning. Even the light fixtures were ornate, their frosted glass globes glowing with a soft, steady electric light. "This is first class," Yumi whispered from the seat beside Haruko. "This is for daimyo, for lords." Haruko could only nod. She touched the velvet curtain that hung beside the window, running her fingers over the soft nap. In Japan, such luxury would be reserved for the highest ranks of society. Here it was apparently the standard way to transport prisoners. The train began to move. Not with the jarring lurch Haruko had expected, but with a smooth, powerful glide. One moment they were stationary. The next they were sliding forward with such steadiness that Haruko barely felt the transition. The engineering required to achieve such smooth motion was beyond anything she had experienced. A different guard came through the car, older than the corporal who had given her the shoes, with a weathered face that suggested long years of service. He carried a heavy silver pot. "Coffee, ladies," he said. His tone was polite, almost friendly, as if he were working in a restaurant rather than guarding prisoners. They were given coffee in thick white porcelain mugs, real china, not tin cups, not wooden bowls. Porcelain. The coffee was hot and black and sweet with sugar. Along with it came a box of food for each woman. A sandwich made of thick, soft white bread with some kind of meat and cheese inside. A piece of fruit, an orange so bright and perfect it looked artificial. A wrapped piece of chocolate with English words printed on the wrapper. The women ate in stunned silence. This was not prisoner rations. This was not even military rations. This was the kind of meal you might pack for a pleasant day trip, a picnic in the countryside with friends. "This is how they travel," the older guard said. He had seen their expressions. He seemed genuinely pleased by their surprise, like a host showing off his home to impress guests. "This is just how trains are here. Just how trains are here." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement from an oracle. This abundance, this comfort, this casual luxury was not special. It was not unusual. It was simply normal. This was the baseline, the starting point, the minimum standard for transportation in America. Haruko looked down at the canvas shoes on her feet. She had not taken them off. She was terrified they would be taken from her, that this whole experience was some elaborate, cruel joke that would end with everything being stripped away. But the shoes remained, the coffee remained, the sandwich remained. All of it was real. All of it was happening. As the train cleared the sprawling yards of Oakland, the landscape of America began to reveal itself. They sped past suburbs, endless rows of neat wooden houses, each one with its own square of green grass, each one with an automobile parked in the driveway. Not military vehicles, private cars, one for almost every house. The wealth required to achieve such a thing was incomprehensible. Then they entered the great Central Valley of California, and Haruko understood that she had never truly comprehended the meaning of the word abundance. This was not a landscape of small, meticulously tended rice paddies, each one representing generations of backbreaking labor. This was an ocean of agriculture. Fields stretched to the horizon in every direction, so vast that entire Japanese villages could be lost in a single plot. And the fields were not worked by men with oxen. They were worked by machines. Giant, brightly painted tractors crawled over the land, pulling plows that turned 10 furrows at once. Mechanical harvesters moved through wheat fields like predators, consuming crops and spitting out bound sheaves. Electric pumps hummed at regular intervals, drawing water from deep wells and spraying it in perfect glittering arcs over the growing plants. So much Yumi breathed. Her face was pressed against the glass. They have machines to do the work of 1,000 men. And the war is not even here. Their fields are not burned. Their crops are not destroyed. They grow food while they fight us. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Japan had mobilized everything. Every farm boy was a soldier. Every field was neglected or worked by women and old men struggling to produce enough rice to prevent starvation. The American breadbasket, meanwhile, grew food with such efficiency that they could feed their own population, feed their military, feed their allies, and still have surplus to store in vast warehouses against future need. You could not defeat such abundance with courage. You could not overcome such industrial capacity with spiritual strength. Japan had been fighting a war it could never win, and everyone who died in that futile struggle had been sacrificed to a lie. The true revelation came with darkness. As the sun began to set over the endless California fields, Haruko braced herself for the familiar descent into blackout conditions. In Japan, sunset meant the end of all light, the beginning of enforced darkness that would last until dawn. To light a match near a window was to risk a beating. To show any illumination was to invite American bombers. But America did not go dark. America ignited. First came the farmhouses. One by one, as dusk settled over the valley, yellow squares of light appeared in windows. Warm golden rectangles that glowed defiantly against the gathering darkness. Not dim candles behind blackout curtains, not carefully shielded lanterns, but bright electric lights shining through uncovered windows, announcing to the world that people were home, that they were cooking dinner, that they were living their lives without fear. Haruko watched with her heart pounding. This was madness. This was suicide. Every one of those lights was a beacon for enemy bombers. Every illuminated window was a target. But the lights kept appearing, hundreds of them, thousands of them, spreading across the valley like stars coming out at night. Then the train passed through a small town, and Haruko's understanding of the world shifted again. The streets were lined with electric lamps, tall poles topped with glowing globes that cast pools of white light onto the pavement below. Shop windows blazed. Cars moved through the streets with their headlights on bright twin beams cutting through the dusk. And above it all, in the town square, a clock tower shone like a lighthouse, its 4 illuminated faces visible for miles in every direction. But it was the signs that stopped Haruko's breath entirely. Signs made of glass tubes bent into letters and shapes filled with gas that glowed with impossible liquid colors. Red, electric blue, vivid green. The colors should not exist. They were too bright, too pure, too saturated to be real. Yet there they were, blazing in the gathering darkness. Coca-Cola spelled out in flowing script that pulsed red against the night. Ford in blue letters above a car dealership where rows of new automobiles gleamed under spotlights. Drugs marking a pharmacy with a green cross that seemed to float in midair. Each sign was a small miracle of engineering and a massive declaration of waste. The electricity required to power even one of those signs would have kept a Japanese village lit for a month. Here they were scattered across every town like decorative flourishes, serving no purpose except to look beautiful. A movie theater marquee blazed with hundreds of individual bulbs flashing in sequence to spell out the name of a film Haruko had never heard of. The marquee alone probably consumed more electricity in one night than her entire neighborhood in Hiroshima used in a year. And it was advertising a comedy. Not a war film, not propaganda, a comedy. Americans were going to theaters to laugh while the war ground on thousands of miles away. The train rushed past, but the lights followed them. Every town was an island of illumination. Every crossroads had at least a few lights marking gas stations or roadside diners. The highways, when they crossed under or over the train tracks, were rivers of moving headlights, cars and trucks flowing in both directions without apparent concern for fuel rationing or military necessity. "They are not afraid," Haruko whispered to herself. The words came out unbidden, a realization so profound it felt like a physical blow. They waste so much light. They must not be afraid of anything. Beside her, Yumi was crying silently, tears streaming down her face in the reflected glow of the passing lights. "Our leaders," she said, her voice breaking into fragments. "They lied to us. They lied about everything." Haruko did not answer. She could not. Her throat was too tight with emotions she could not name. Rage at the lies, grief for the dead, shame at having believed, wonder at the sheer magnificent arrogance of a nation that could light up the night sky just because it wanted to. All of these feelings swirled together into something too large and complex to articulate. Keiko Yamamoto sat across the aisle staring out the window with empty eyes. She had not spoken since the ship had barely eaten, had moved through the world like a ghost. But now her lips moved silently, forming words that Haruko could not hear. She was praying, or perhaps she was apologizing to her dead sons, telling them that everything they had died for was a beautiful, terrible lie. The train climbed into the Sierra Nevada mountains, and for a brief time the darkness returned. The pines were thick here, blocking out the towns and farms. The only lights were the train's own and the occasional gleam of a ranger station or fire lookout perched high on some rocky outcrop. But even in the mountains there was no true blackout. The train's windows blazed. The locomotive's headlight carved a bright tunnel through the darkness ahead. The Americans lit up the night wherever they went, as if darkness itself was an enemy to be conquered. Then they descended into the high desert of Nevada, and in the distance a glow appeared on the horizon. At first, Haruko thought it might be a fire, some disaster consuming a town. But as they drew closer, the glow resolved into something far stranger. It was a city, a small city sitting in the middle of the desert, glowing so brightly it seemed to be made entirely of light. Reno, the corporal, said, "Sam Nolan, the one who had given Haruko the shoes." He was walking down the aisle, checking windows and making sure the prisoners were settled for the night. He saw Haruko staring at the approaching glow. "Biggest little city in the world," he said. His tone was casual, almost proud, as if this explained everything. The train slowed as it approached the city, and Haruko saw Reno in all its improbable glory. Casinos lined the main street, each one trying to outshine its neighbors with ever more elaborate displays of neon light. Signs 20 feet tall advertised gambling and shows and restaurants. Some signs moved their lights, chasing each other in endless loops. Others flashed on and off in patterns designed to catch the eye and hold it. The entire city was a celebration of electricity, a middle finger raised to the very concept of darkness and rationing and fear. The women sat mesmerized, their faces painted by the flashing colors that poured through the train windows. Red and blue and green and yellow and pink and orange, all the colors blending and shifting and pulsing with manic energy. This was not a city at war. This was a city at play. While Japanese soldiers died of starvation on jungle islands, while Japanese cities burned under firebomb raids, Americans were gambling and drinking and watching shows in a neon wonderland in the middle of the Nevada desert. "It was all a lie," Yumi said. She was not crying anymore. Her voice was flat, dead emptied of emotion. "Everything they told us. Every word was a lie." Haruko looked down at the canvas shoes on her feet. She looked out the window at the ocean of light, that defied the very concept of war and sacrifice. She thought about her brother Takeshi, about the letters he had written describing the honor of dying for the emperor. She thought about all the men who had charged into machine gun fire on Saipan, believing their sacrifice would turn the tide of the war. She thought about the women who had clutched grenades in dark caves, choosing death over the dishonor of capture. This was not a nation of decadent, weak individuals. This was a civilization so powerful it could afford to be kind. It was a power that did not demand sacrifice from its people. It was built on an energy so vast it could light up the entire night sky as a gesture of pure abundance, just because it could. The train sped on its rhythm, steady and hypnotic, the clickety-clack of wheels on rails, the sound of a continent that had never learned the meaning of fear. Haruko leaned her head against the cool window glass and watched America scroll past in all its impossible glory. And she understood finally and completely that the war had been over before it began. I want to pause the story here for a moment because what is about to happen is something many of you experience firsthand. If you grew up in the 1940s and 50s, you remember a time when America's strength was not just military. It was industrial, cultural morale. You remember when towns glowed with pride, when factories ran 3 shifts, when abundance was not something to apologize for. The generation watching this video right now, your generation built the country that Haruko was about to witness. And I want to ask you, what do you remember most about that post-war confidence? What made America different? Share your memories in the comments. Because these stories are not just history, they are a map back to values we need to preserve. Now back to that train in 1904 as it crossed the desert toward Texas. The landscape changed again as they left Nevada behind. The high desert gave way to flat scrubland, then to rolling hills covered in short brown grass that looked nothing like the lush rice paddies of home. This was big sky country, a land of vast distances and horizontal lines that seemed to stretch forever. The air that came through the ventilation system was no longer dry and cool. It was thick, wet, and suffocatingly hot. On the morning of the 5th day, the train's whistle blew long and mournful. The brakes hissed. The rhythmic motion that had been their world for nearly a week came to a gradual stop. A guard walked through the car. "All right, ladies," he called out. "End of the line. Grab your gear. Welcome to Texas." They stepped down from the cool, dark, civilized interior of the train car into a wall of heat. The light was blinding, a shimmering white glare that reflected off pale, dusty ground and made Haruko's eyes water. The temperature must have been over 100 degrees, and the humidity wrapped around them like a wet blanket. This was a different kind of heat than the jungle. The jungle had been green and alive. This was brown and infinite and utterly indifferent to human suffering. In the distance, rows of simple, black-tarred wooden barracks stretched in a precise military grid, surrounded by fences that glittered with barbed wire. Camp Swift. That was the name painted on a sign near the gate, but it was not the camp that held Haruko's attention. It was the guards. They were not the Marines from the ship. They were not the MPs from the train. These men were different, tall and lean with weathered faces the color of saddle leather. They wore the same tan uniforms as other soldiers, but their hats were different, wide-brimmed with high crowns, cowboy hats. And their boots were wrong for soldiers, high-heeled with pointed toes and decorative stitching. Cowboy boots. And they had horses. Haruko had seen cavalry horses in Japan, small, scrappy animals pressed into military service. These were something else entirely. These were titans. Sleek, powerful beasts that stood 16 hands high with coats that gleamed like polished wood. They stamped their feet impatiently in the dust, their muscles rippling under their skin. A man dismounted from a tall chestnut horse, and as he walked toward the train, Haruko heard a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Jingle, jangle, jingle, jangle. A small metallic singing sound coming from his boots. Spurs. He had actual metal spurs attached to his heels, wheels with small points that rotated as he walked. The man approached the MP who was in charge of the prisoner transport. He had a face like tanned leather, creased and weathered by decades of sun and wind. His eyes were pale blue, startling against his dark skin. He looked over the column of Japanese women with those pale eyes, and his expression showed nothing. Not hostility, not kindness, not curiosity. He was just looking the way a rancher might look at a herd of cattle he had been asked to move from one pasture to another. "Got them, do you?" he said to the MP. His voice was a low, musical drawl that stretched his words into strange new shapes, adding syllables that did not exist in any English Haruko had been taught. Well, reckon we will get them settled in. Come on, girls. He did not tip his hat. He did not smile. He just gestured with his chin toward the gate and turned back to his horse. The other mounted guards, perhaps a dozen of them, moved their horses into formation around the column of prisoners. They sat in their saddles with the kind of easy grace that suggested they had been born there, that the horse was not a separate animal, but an extension of their own bodies. Haruko began to walk surrounded by men on horseback who moved as if they had stepped out of the old American films she had seen before the war. Cowboys and Indians, the Wild West. She had thought those films were fantasies, exaggerations designed to sell tickets. But here they were, real cowboys, in the middle of World War II, guarding a prison camp full of Japanese nurses with the same casual competence they might bring to herding cattle across an open range. She had been taken from her island by metal demons in ships of steel. She had been carried across the ocean by a floating city powered by engines. She had crossed a continent on a train that moved with the smooth power of modern engineering. And now she had been delivered to a prison camp run by cowboys, men on horses, men with spurs, men who belonged to the 19th century but were somehow here in 1944 serving their country in the way they knew best. This was America. It was a land of machines and a land of myth all at once. It was a place where the latest technology coexisted with the oldest traditions. It was a nation so vast and so diverse that it contained multitudes, contradictions, impossibilities. And it was all real. The gates of Camp Swift closed behind them with a well-oiled thud. Not the grim clang of a prison door sealing shut, just the efficient mechanical sound of a gate designed to open and close 1,000 times without complaint. The cowboys dismounted and tied their horses to a rail, then walked toward the admin building with that same rolling gait, their spurs singing with every step. The women were led to their barracks by a female officer, an American woman in uniform who looked to be in her 40s. She was brisk and efficient, but not unkind. She showed them the bunks, the latrines, the wash stations. She explained the rules in slow, clear English, using gestures when words failed. Meals at 600, 1,200, and 1,800 hours. Lights out at 2,200. Work assignments would begin tomorrow. The barracks were not the lice-infested hovels that propaganda had promised. They were simple but perfect. The planks were precisely cut and fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of skilled carpenters who took pride in their work. The tar paper roofs were immaculate, not a leak or a gap to be seen. The windows were not barred holes, but panes of clean, clear glass that slid open on well-greased tracks to let in the breeze. When Haruko stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not unwashed bodies and fear and human waste, but pine, fresh-cut lumber, floor polish. Someone had cleaned these barracks recently, had swept and mopped, and made them ready for new occupants. The second thing she noticed was the light. Hanging from the ceiling in the center of the room was a single naked glass bulb. It was the middle of the day, bright sunlight streaming through the windows. But the bulb was on, glowing with steady white light, entirely unnecessary, utterly wasteful. A guard who had been showing them the facilities saw Haruko staring at the light. He walked to the wall and flipped a small black switch. The light vanished. He flipped it again. The light returned. He smiled as if he had just performed a magic trick for children. Electricity, he said. You just flipped the switch. That night, as dusk fell over Camp Swift, Haruko witnessed the final proof of American abundance. The entire camp bloomed with light. Every barrack glowed from within. Every guard tower blazed with spotlights. Strings of bulbs illuminated the paths between buildings. And the perimeter fence, the tall chain-link barrier topped with coils of barbed wire, was bathed in a harsh white glare from floodlights mounted on tall poles. The lights turned night into an artificial day. They eliminated every shadow, every dark corner, every hiding place. In Japan, a single dim bulb in a command bunker was a luxury reserved for the highest officers. Here they used electricity as a weapon, a casual blinding declaration that they had so much power they could afford to simply throw it at the darkness and make it go away. Haruko stood at the window of the barracks, looking out at the illuminated camp. Behind her, some of the other women were already asleep, exhausted by the journey. Others sat on their bunks talking quietly or writing letters they knew might never be delivered. But Haruko could not sleep, could not rest, could not do anything except stand and stare at the lights and try to process what she had learned. The disorientation deepened over the following days as they settled into the routine of the camp. They were assigned to work details, and each assignment was a further descent into the looking-glass world of American abundance. The camp laundry was not a room where women beat clothes against rocks or scrubbed them by hand in wooden tubs. It was a cavern filled with thunderous rotating steel drums, washing machines, enormous industrial machines that could process hundreds of pounds of laundry in a single load. American women civilians from the nearby town moved with unhurried ease through the facility, feeding rivers of soiled uniforms into the machines which steamed and churned and spat them out clean minutes later. The Japanese women were put to work folding the clean laundry. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. Mountains of clean, warm cotton, sheets and towels and uniforms, all perfectly laundered, all smelling of soap and bleach. The waste was staggering. A towel with a small stain was discarded rather than mended. A sheet with a torn corner was thrown away rather than repaired. In Japan, fabric was precious. Every scrap was used and reused until it literally fell apart. Here it was disposable. The kitchens were even more astonishing. They were kingdoms of white tile and stainless steel. The ovens were not wood-fired pits or coal stoves. They were massive enameled boxes with glass windows through which you could watch the food cooking. They had precise temperature dials and timer bells. They could roast 100 pounds of meat at once without anyone having to tend the fire. The refrigerators were walk-in rooms, entire chambers kept cold by electric motors that hummed constantly in the background. Inside were sides of beef hanging from hooks, crates of eggs, stacked 10-high mountains of butter, wrapped in wax paper, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, milk in glass bottles. The abundance was obscene. The camp kitchen held more food than Haruko had seen in her entire life, and this was just the daily supply replenished every morning by trucks that arrived like clockwork. The head cook was a massive sweating man in a white apron, and he yelled constantly. But he did not yell out of cruelty. He yelled because the industrial mixers and fans were so loud that normal conversation was impossible. "Get those spuds peeled," he would boom, pointing at a literal mountain of potatoes. "We ain't got all day." They were feeding thousands. Prisoners and guards and administrative staff and workers from the nearby town. The kitchen operated with factory efficiency, churning out 3 hot meals a day, plus snacks and coffee that was always available. The scraps they threw away, the peelings and trimmings and burned bits, amounted to more food than Haruko had eaten in a month on Saipan. One afternoon during the second week, Yumi collapsed while working in the garden detail. The heat was brutal, over 100 degrees, with humidity that made the air feel like wet wool. Yumi's face went pale and she crumpled to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. Haruko's nurse training took over instantly. She ran to her friend, checked her pulse, felt her forehead. Fever, dehydration, possibly heat stroke. She shouted for the guards, and within minutes they had Yumi on a stretcher, carrying her toward the camp infirmary. Haruko followed, her heart pounding. She expected a tent with cots, maybe a few basic supplies, perhaps a tired doctor who would do what he could with limited resources. What she found was a building that was cleaner and better equipped than any hospital in Osaka. The floors were white linoleum, polished to a mirror shine. The light came from long, humming tubes of fluorescent gas, bright and even and shadowless. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something chemical and modern that Haruko could not identify. The American doctor was an older man with steel-rimmed glasses and gray hair. He examined Yumi with brisk, gentle hands, checking her temperature, listening to her heart, looking in her eyes with a small, focused light. "Dehydration and a touch of fever," he said to Haruko, speaking to her as if she were a colleague rather than a prisoner. "We will keep her overnight. Get some fluids in her. Maybe a little penicillin just in case." "You are a nurse?" he asked, seeing the way Haruko watched his examination. "Yes," Haruko whispered. "Good, you can help." He led Haruko and the semi-conscious Yumi into an examination room. There was a strange machine against one wall, a large boxy device with a protruding arm. The doctor positioned Yumi carefully in front of it, then stepped behind a lead screen. The machine hummed, just for a moment, a brief mechanical sound that seemed too quiet to be important. The doctor emerged from behind the screen and walked to a developing tank. Moments later, he was holding a large sheet of translucent film up to a glowing light box mounted on the wall. On the film, rendered in ghostly shades of black and white and gray, was the intricate, delicate structure of Yumi's rib cage, her spine, her lungs, an X-ray, for a prisoner, for a simple fever. Haruko stood frozen, staring at the image. In Japan, X-ray machines existed only in the very best hospitals in the largest cities, and they were reserved for the most serious cases. Here in a prison camp in rural Texas, they were using one to check a prisoner for pneumonia, just to be safe. "Looks clear," the doctor said, studying the film. "No fluid in the lungs, just needs rest and hydration." He turned to Haruko. "You can sit with her if you like." That evening, Haruko sat beside Yumi's bed in the infirmary, watching an intravenous drip feed fluids into her friend's arm from a glass bottle suspended on a metal stand. The technology, the waste, the casual routine application of advanced medical care to an enemy prisoner. It was too much. The contradictions were too large. Her mind could not hold them all. "We are not prisoners," Haruko thought. "We are subjects in an incomprehensible experiment. We are being shown something. But what and why?" The answer would come the following week in a drainage ditch filled with thick black Texas mud. The weeks that followed became a kaleidoscope of impossibilities. Each day brought new evidence that the world Haruko had believed in was built on lies, and each night she stood at the barracks window, watching Camp Swift blaze with light, trying to comprehend what it meant to live without fear. The work details continued. The laundry machines roared. The kitchen produced its endless feast. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the women began to change. Not in their loyalty to Japan, that remained torn and bleeding, but still alive. They changed in their understanding of what America was. Not devils, not angels, just people with so much abundance they could afford to be careless with it. 3 weeks after the X-ray incident, Sergeant Frank Mitchell assigned Haruko to a drainage ditch detail. A thunderstorm had flooded the channels with thick black Texas clay, the kind locals called gumbo. Sam Nolan was there too, supervising with his characteristic tired kindness. And when Haruko's precious canvas shoe was sucked into the mud, when she panicked and reached for it, Sam waded into the muck without hesitation. He plunged his arm in, up to the elbow, face contorted with effort, and retrieved it. Then he walked to the water barrel and rinsed it clean, his uniform covered in filth, and handed it back to her with nothing more than a weary smile. "She loses a shoe she can't work," he told Mitchell, who had started to object. "I was just solving a problem." That night, watching an outdoor movie she could not understand, Haruko approached Sam at the water barrel. She had to know. "Why?" she asked in her broken English. Why kind Sam looked at her with those old young eyes. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we're laughing because there's a war. That's how we get through it." He paused and then said the words that would echo in her mind for 50 years. And we know we're going to win. It was not a boast. It was not propaganda. It was simply true. December brought cold, thin rain and an announcement that stunned them. The camp would hold a Christmas service. A choir from Bastrop would perform. The prisoners were invited to attend. In the recreation hall decorated with pine branches and electric lights that glowed like jewels, Haruko heard a melody she recognized from her mission school days. "Silent Night," the choir sang in English. And then, unbidden, the Japanese words rose from her throat. "Kiyoshi kono yoru." Other women joined. Yumi, even Keiko, who had barely spoken since the ship. The choir director smiled and raised her hands. Two languages wove together in the same ancient melody. English and Japanese an enemy singing the same prayer in a wooden hall in Texas while the war raged on. When the song ended, there was no applause. The silence was too sacred, too fragile. Sergeant Mitchell stood in the back, his weathered face wet with tears he did not bother to hide. That night, Haruko saw the cowboys again. They sat on their horses outside the fence, silent witnesses under the stars. The leathery-faced man lifted one finger from his reins in quiet salute. Then they vanished into the darkness, their spurs singing one last time. Spring brought news that traveled through the camp like electricity. Germany had surrendered. Then in August, the unthinkable. Japan itself had capitulated. The emperor, the divine emperor, had spoken on the radio. The war was over. The women did not celebrate. They sat in the dust of the parade ground, emptied of everything they had believed. The God they would have died for was just a man. The sacrifices had been for nothing, not defeat, evaporation. But repatriation came swiftly. They were processed out with the same efficient kindness that had defined their captivity. New clothes, travel documents. And at the train station, Sam Nolan was waiting with the escort detail. He looked older. The war's end had not erased the exhaustion from his eyes. But when Haruko approached with her small diary, the notebook where she had documented everything electric lights and x-rays and kindness, he smiled. That real, slow smile she had come to recognize. "You keep writing," he said, pressing a silver Parker pen into her hand. "You're a nurse. You know how to see things clear. You write down the truth." As the train pulled away, Sergeant Mitchell appeared at attention. He saluted the prisoners, the first and only time he showed them military respect. "Safe journey home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The voyage back across the Pacific was silent. When the ship entered Yokohama Harbor, there was no skyline, only rubble, flattened as far as the eye could see under a gray chemical sky. The people on the docks were shadows thin and hollow-eyed, staring at the returning prisoners with dull, envious hatred. These women were healthy, clean, wearing new shoes. Haruko stepped onto the shattered docks, clutching the American pen in her pocket. This was the price of the lie. America had not defeated Japan with cruelty. It had defeated them with abundance, with x-rays for prisoners and hot showers and lights that blazed all night, with cowboys who sat their horses like kings and soldiers who waded into mud to retrieve a single lost shoe. 50 years later, an elderly woman walked through a small museum on the grounds of what had once been Camp Swift. Her name was Haruko Matsuda. She had spent half a century as one of Tokyo's most respected surgical nurses, rebuilding her country one patient at a time. She paused at a photograph of mounted guards, their faces weathered and confident. She paused at a display case containing a pair of old canvas shoes donated by a veteran's family. At the guest register, she took a faded silver Parker pen from her purse. In clear, precise English, she wrote, "We arrived as servants of a dying God. We were taught to fear devils, but we were met by men. In this place I saw a nation so powerful it did not need to be cruel, and so rich it could light up the darkness. The soldiers gave us back our lives, but it was the cowboys silent at the fence who showed us the true geography of freedom." She set down the pen, touched the glass case with the shoes one last time, and walked into the Texas sunlight. The canvas shoes she had been given that day in San Francisco had fallen apart decades ago, but she had kept the laces, because they reminded her of the day she learned that power and kindness were not opposites, that America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its factories, but its fundamental belief that even enemies deserve dignity. That was the lesson of Camp Swift. That was the truth that shattered everything. And that was the story she would carry until her last breath, a testament to the ordinary men who had shown extraordinary mercy when the world gave them every reason to be cruel.